we're good to go.
Thank you.
All right. I think I got my Wi-Fi working. Okay, got my laptop working with Wi-Fi finally. All right. Guess we're good to go.
We are.
So we'll call the meeting to order. And trying to bring up my agenda. Didn't, there we go. There it is. Okay, so first we have is the Pledge of Allegiance, if John would like to lead us in that as he has in the past.
I will. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Thank you all. All right, so we have no minutes to approve in this meeting and no rolls accounts or committee reports. Public comments, again, we'll save those to the end of the agenda if there's no, if no one has an issue with that, as we have done. So if there's anybody out there listening online, if you'd like to call in with a comment at the end, please do so. So we have do we have a budget abstract for the finance? It looks like that's what we have next.
No, we don't have a budget abstract for this meeting.
Oh, okay. Saw that on the agenda, so. Okay, so I guess we go right to Peter's report.
Yeah, and I'll be very brief. Just want to announce that the last day of school for students this year is going to be June 11th for students. Last day for staff will be June 14th, which is the following Monday. We only used one, of course, snow day this year, so that puts us at that end date. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we're still looking for a board member to represent District 3. So I know that many of you have perhaps reached out and had conversations with potential candidates. I know that Joel had some thoughts on this evening that maybe he wanted to share as well, and I'll turn it over to Joel to talk about that a little bit.
So I was just, the thought I had now that we have our new electronic signs at the two schools, the two buildings, I guess, 3 schools. I was just wondering what the thought was regarding potentially putting something on that sign regarding looking for a District 3 representative. Thought that might be a way to get somebody to show some interest in it, and we surely need to fill our roster. So, some board members that'd like to weigh in, or anybody else that'd like to weigh in regarding that thought? We haven't had them very long, so just want to make sure we're talking about what we're doing.
I think it's a great idea, personally.
I agree.
I think that sign's going to come in handy.
Yep. Okay, well, that sounds good. I thought we'd be good to get somebody on board before we get into the summer, and obviously if we haven't got people driving in and out from the schools through the summer, that signage doesn't accomplish nearly as much. So yeah, I guess, Peter, if you'd like to, whoever puts together the signage there, I guess something short and simple would be good. And I guess I don't know if you want to have them contact the central office or have them contact me, or probably through the central office, probably be easier.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Joel, we can do that.
Keep the message short and sweet on the sign. That's probably easiest.
Yep. I don't know if anyone would have a short description of that area, but by putting just the district, you might not get some people who don't know they live in that district. So maybe a central street area or something, just so someone has an idea where the district, not everyone is aware of the lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would be tough to put on the sign because you're limited on how many characters per line.
Just one
Short
street.
and sweet is what works.
In other words, in our neighborhood, it would be like Cushman Road area. 3 words. I don't know if there's enough for that, but
Yep, we'll come up with something to advertise that, and I'll send it to you, Joel, to take a look at it before we send it out, and we'll try to include some type of descriptor, John, so that people would have an indication of where it is. It's a really good idea. That sign is there for informational purposes, and this is just one more reason why it can be used.
Yeah, I think if, I don't know how much you can get on the sign, or like you say, I think keeping it short and sweet probably works better as people are driving by. But at least, if we can't get the location information on the sign, if we're pointing them to a website or something to that effect, we could maybe give them more description when they get right to that website.
Yep,
Might
good
be a
idea.
place to put that detail, but I guess if we're going to put a detailed area, it would be Halifax Street area if we're going to simplify it. So,
Okay, I'm on it.
all right, great. Hopefully we have some takers because it's been a while. So,
That's it for me, Joel. I'm looking forward to the next part of the presentation.
all right. So next up is old business with the first reading of the 2021-2022 budget. And we have an update on the return school plan. So we'll talk about the budget. So Peter has some good information, I believe, for us on that.
I think we do. I'm going to ask Amanda to display or present the revenue worksheet that we had last looked at. So if you recall, when we last met, this was our projected second draft of the revenue worksheet. And you can see that the total request in this particular situation was the $17,195,878. And then if you worked your way down through, and I won't take you through all the steps because we've done this quite a few times now, but if you look at our revenues, and if you look at the expenditure request at the bottom where it says the tax appropriation for K-12 programming was $8,500,378.47, and you can see what that increase was to the local taxes if this was the final number. We were very fortunate in that we were waiting for our insurance rates, and this version of the budget represented a 5% increase to our insurance rates, not really knowing what that increase would be. Of course, we had budgeted 10%, and we had mentioned to you before that each percent is worth about 25,000, give or take, because changes are constantly made to individuals, and depending on who's in a position or who transfers into a position, it impacts with that number. So we did receive our rates, and we were very pleased to hear that our rates this year came in at 0, which is outstanding. So that was a huge benefit. And the rates at 0 reflects a continuation of the modified risk pool methodology, which was introduced by 2013 by NMEA Benefits Trust. And it allows school districts with 51 or more eligible employees, including retirees, to benefit from good experience, low standard claim utilization, or a favorable medical loss ratio. So this is great news for us, because here's what happens. When you look at this cut and adjustment list, this is the same list that you saw before. However, the insurance savings is now $268,563.98, which is a huge lift in our sales, so to speak. The other pieces that you see there that we've talked about before, the accreditation piece and the computer lease, these are all things that we're going to try to purchase with another funding source, or if we have money left at the end of this year, we're going to look at that first to see if we can utilize that. If we have anything left, we would certainly try to buy these things out, so that we can not impact next year's budget. So when you get down to the adjustments, I do want to talk about that just a little bit. You'll see that the adjustments of $19,576 to the Winslow Elementary School PE teacher to unfilled. That's a person who's retired. So what you see there is the potential savings. And I say potential because we budget 5 years for the masters. We don't know who's going to fill that position. So that's the potential savings from who's currently in that position. And then you'll see the additional art offerings and startup costs. We've talked about this. This is the increase in the salary plus the startup cost for that digital arts program. We've had some internal transfers already. The domino effect has begun, where you have one person leaving, another person internal transfer. So that effect has begun. And so in this budget right now, you see that's impacted us in a positive way. We've been able to reduce, cut another $13,263.37. And then we, of course, had the adjustments for the additional speech services at $42,000. So you'll see that the total cuts and adjustments now we're at $442,028.89. So what that means to the bigger picture is this. When you look at our requests now, our total request, $17,039,114.46. You'll see that that's a 0.94% increase over our total request of last year. But the bigger news is, as you work through our revenues, because there's two sides to the budget, the expenditure and the revenues. As you work through our revenues, you notice that this year, as we had mentioned to you before, we did well with our state subsidy. We got a significant gain in our state subsidy because of the modifications that they made to the student ratio component. And we didn't lose that many students to homeschooling like other districts did. So our state subsidy stayed at $337,941. I shouldn't say stayed, it increased to that with the educational service center allocation is included in that number. So if you stay with me and you stay in that next to last column and you drop down to where it says total state and school revenues, you'll see now that number has changed to $8,695,532. If you take the total request of $17,039,114 and you subtract the revenues that we have to apply towards that, you come up with a tax appropriation for the locals at $8,343,614.14. That is a negative 0.21% from last year, or we are requesting $17,908.45 less than last year's tax appropriation. So we are better than flat funded on the local side at this point in time. So that's, I think, very good news. for the school district, and that we won't be asking for any additional local dollars to support this budget. So
I believe John,
having said
I think
that,
John had a question.
open it up for questions.
I just wanted to know, I think that's the first time that I've been on the board that that's ever been a parentheses. I don't remember that ever being in parentheses, which is a very good thing.
It certainly doesn't happen often, John. That's for sure. Doesn't happen often. So I would open it up for any other questions that you might have, but here's another way of looking at this, another summary. So the total expenditure request, there you see it. The total state and school revenues that we have to apply for it is there. So the tax appropriation for K-12, you see that number. And you see the 2021 tax appropriation, you see the difference. And so that's where we sit right now.
Was there any other board members that had questions at this point? Okay, not seeing any. Yeah, I have to say it's a pretty amazing result to mirror what John said. Having done this as many years, it's usually not this favorable, but I guess I would say that I think it goes with the mode we've been operating for, that we don't ask for things that we don't need. And I think this says something, because I don't know how many people would come in with a negative request. So I think it reinforces that when we ask for something, that is what we need to offer what we think we need to offer. And when we don't need it and we're good, then we show that as well. So I think this reflects that. So I'm pretty pleased with that. We ought to frame that on the wall.
It certainly will be a good reflection for future discussion with the town council, because having this as a arrow in your quiver couldn't hurt.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes a long ways toward, I mean, I've tuned into a number of the budget workshops that the council is doing, and aside from the meetings, the regular meetings as well. And, you know, they're obviously struggling with the town budget and some of the needs that the town have in regards to particularly roads, obviously being one of the big things, but other needs. And so of all years to come up without having to ask for more money, this is probably a really good year for that, because they're struggling already with the need to have to raise taxes without a school budget that requires additional funding. So I think that's, the timing couldn't be better. So that's good. So any other comments? I don't have everybody on my screen here, but so if not, Peter, we're looking to do a first reading on this. Is this correct?
I would recommend that you do a first reading this evening, because this is the number that after this meeting, I know the town council has been waiting to hear if we had any adjustments. I wanted to bring this to your attention first before bringing it to the town council to see if you're comfortable with this, and then bringing it to them. So I would give them this information this evening if the opportunity presents itself. I had emailed Erica to say that I would be joining their meeting a little late, but I think they would appreciate knowing where we stand so that they can plan as well. So
Sounds good.
I think it would be important for you, the board, to take a first read on this, and obviously we won't take a second read until after the budget is officially passed.
Right. So there's opportunity for adjustments if the council comes back with some other adjustments. If we need to readdress anything, but I think we're probably going to be good. So, that being said,
I do have one question I just thought of. In this new 4-room addition to the elementary school, is there any part of that that would not come under the other money budget? In other words, is there any monies that we should be planning ahead in the costs that would be associated with that that couldn't be put under that? You know, in other words, we've never seen a situation where a negative number. Maybe we better make sure we're not going to forget something important.
Yeah, well, that's a conversation that I want to have a little bit. That's a really good question, number one, John. It's a conversation that I would like to have as part of this agenda when we get down to the ESSER 3 funding, because there are a lot of intersections that come together during that conversation. There's a lot of pieces to consider, and that what you just mentioned, the possibility of using ESSER funds to add an addition on the elementary school, is something that I would like to talk about and get your feedback and your input and your thoughts on all of this.
Okay.
And I think I'll answer, but the quick answer to your question is, if you were to decide that that's an avenue that you would want to approach, it would not be to any, it would not be any local tax money that would be used to do something like that.
Good. So even the planning / architect fees wouldn't be, that'd be covered in those dollars. Is
The planning / architect fees would all be covered under the ESSER funding. Yes, if that is something that you would want to move ahead with.
thank you.
okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, not hearing any, I guess I would entertain a motion to approve the first reading of the budget as amended and presented this evening.
So moved.
Second.
That was so moved by Jay, seconded by Earl. Okay. Any further discussions, questions, or comments? Okay, hearing none, all in favor of approving the first reading?
Let me do a roll
I would-
call on this, Bill.
Yeah, I would be a yes.
Okay. Earl Watts,
Yes.
Jeff Riddell,
Yes.
Jay McIntyre,
Yes.
Nathan Tyler,
Yes.
and John Perry.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your support and work on this. The administrative team worked extremely hard to get us to this point. Kudos to them for looking at what their needs are. And as you said, Joel, presenting a budget that is something that they'll address their needs and still being fiscally responsible to the community, because I think everybody knows this is a very difficult year all around. So thank you very much for all.
Yes, thank you again to everybody, administration and all, for all your hard work on that. It's a great looking budget for considering the situation we're in. So thank you all for your efforts. It's always such a joy that you guys start on in what about November, December, just when you're getting your feet wet into what was a wonderful start of a year. So, well, thank you. Before we go on to the next item, I kind of breezed by quickly on administrative reports. Were there anything, I know it was a special meeting, but I don't know if there was anything any administrators had that they needed to bring up this evening? Okay, I see lots of head shaking, so that's good. All right. So next one, update on a return to school plan.
Yeah, we have a couple of things that we'd like to update you on that return to school plan. One is some work that we've done, and the other is some work that will be done. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. This has been a tough one for us. I don't think there's anybody who's on this screen this evening, including the board and including parents who are watching, or anybody on Black Radio News who's watching tonight, who would say they don't want their kids to be back in school full-time every single day. None of us, I don't think anyone wants to see that. I think we want our kids in school. And I think we know why we want our kids at school, for all the reasons that we've discussed, for all the reasons that have been discussed. We want our kids in school. Having said that, there's a major barrier for us, and that is still the social distancing requirement. And I use the word requirement that we must adhere to in order to be in school. Now, that requirement is, of course, the 3 feet from student to student, 6 feet from student to staff. That is still a barrier for us. And, sometimes I get questions like, well, why isn't it a barrier for somebody else? Well, I listed a few reasons in the email that I sent all of you as to why it might not be a barrier for others. A lot of school districts in the state have many students who have selected to go the remote learning route. And it's a remote learning software package, perhaps, that removes them from the courses that they're typically taking in school. And so because they're on that pathway, they're out of the building, allowing those students who are remaining to participate in in-person learning because they have the space in which to do so. That's one reason. Another reason is a lot of these school districts may have more than one elementary school, and they have large buildings, older, larger buildings. They have extra space in these older, larger buildings, and they're able to spread out because they may not have large class sizes to begin with, and they're able to accommodate the space issue because they have these older buildings with more rooms. We, as you know, have transitioned to an efficient 2-building campus. And on the one hand, when you're not in a global pandemic, it's great because you've transitioned to a situation where it's extremely efficient. You're not heating rooms unnecessarily. You're not doing those things that a lot of the reasons why we transitioned to get out of a building that was costing us money with maintenance, etc. However, throw in a global pandemic and that causes a problem when you have to socially distance. And that really is the biggest barrier for us right now. So we have done our due diligence, and believe me, we've tormented as we've worked through this to see what could we do, to the point where we were raising anxiety and looking at doing things that simply wouldn't make sense because you were undoing what you have in place, and what you were undoing for the short amount of time that you have left wouldn't work as well as what you're currently doing, if that makes sense. So as a result of that, and asking the question from the CDC and asking the question from members of DOE, are these restrictions going to be lifted? And getting the answer, no, they are going to remain in place for the remainder of this year. We realized that the situation that we're in is the situation that we're in for the remainder of this year, as is many other school districts who have our concerns with space. Having said that, we started a conversation down a different path of what can we do? What can we do? Can we look at those students who are most at risk in this environment? And we looked at different criteria that we would consider. And what could we do for those students? What are some options? It might mean that some are invited to come back to school on a more regular basis. It might mean that we look at our existing resources and reallocate those resources to target some of those students who are truly struggling in this learning environment and give them the extra support. When you continue on into the summer, it could mean looking at some type of summer programming and inviting certain students to participate in that programming. And then last but not least, looking ahead into next year, how do you organize yourself in such a way so that you accelerate learning, not just remediate learning? Because there's a lot of history out there on acceleration versus remediation and the impact that one has over the other. So all of these things that I've just mentioned are all things that the building administrators are prepared to give you, and I won't say a 10,000 foot view, but maybe an 8,000 foot view this evening, because we're still in the works of what does this look like for each of the buildings, but they can give you a summary of what they're thinking right now. The other piece is you're going to hear me talk more about additional ESSER funds and CARES money this evening, and what you're going to hear are things that will be paid for with some of this money. So with that, I will turn it over to Erica Gower to speak about the elementary school and what some of her thoughts are at this moment.
Before she gets started, Earl had his hand up.
I'm sorry, Earl.
Have you given any thought to recording what you just said to us and making that available for parents if they have questions? I mean, that's a very good, thorough, articulate, yet concise explanation, and explaining it could go a long way in alleviating questions. That's just my opinion, but I believe that if you can provide information proactively, then you're not reacting.
I appreciate that, Earl. I really do. The thinking was to have this conversation with all of you and to have you give me feedback and some direction. And at the end of this meeting, if you feel as though what we're suggesting that we do with next steps is appropriate, then I would try to do an email to all parents and be as succinct as possible to give them this information as well. But I wanted to start with you first and have you give me the feedback.
Well, I think I'd say that Earl is, I think, correct, and that's a very succinct outline of where we are now and where, as of now, and I guess now we can hear where Erica is going to lead off on telling us where some options might be going forward for the elementary.
Sure.
And we'll see where that leads us.
Thank you. So as everyone's aware, we have had continued conversations about whether we can bring more students back to school full time. We have had brainstorming sessions with our building leadership teams, and they've talked within their own team levels. Kyle and I have created many documents with lists of questions to answer and possible solutions. We have had numerous brainstorming meetings to think about what is best for students at this point in the year. We all agree that students, especially those that are struggling, need to be here more, and that has always been our goal. We have looked at our school as a whole, some specific grade levels, and perhaps even some groups of specific students. We have looked at the staffing needed to make changes and the impact that those changes would have on what we currently can provide students. When we looked at all of this from the big picture standpoint, it became clear that bringing all students or large groups of students back at this point in time would be problematic due to spacing and more disruptive to their learning than beneficial. With that being said, we know that we have specific grade levels where our DRA, our reading scores in particular, are lower than we would like. So if we aren't bringing those students back full time, how are we going to accelerate them for the remainder of the school year, this summer, and next year? We are currently working on a plan for the remainder of this school year to support specific grade levels and to pull as many resources as possible to provide that support. When I say pull as many resources, I mean we've asked a variety of people in our building even to give us a small chunk of time, people who are really qualified to teach reading, but maybe their role right now is a different role. So we've asked them to give a little bit of time. So we'll do this by providing extra interventions on either the day that they're here by maybe extending some of the current time that they have for interventions. In some cases, we will have push-in support within the classroom. We'll offer remote on their non-cohort day or remote at childcare. I've spoken with the childcare in the junior high, and they are on board to help us and make sure that if we have some remote sessions, that kids are able to be over there and set up with their Chromebooks. We've begun working on a plan for a fun and engaging summer program to invite some of our students to attend who are struggling academically. We're hoping to use some of the federal funds to add an additional interventionist to our staff for next year to support the acceleration of these students. Although our current plan doesn't bring large numbers of students back this year, we may be looking at inviting some students back in unique situations based on need. If there are situations we feel like a student does need to come back full-time, we will consult with the teacher and make a plan for that specific student. As with most things this year, and included here, plans change as circumstances change. Can always hope that that spacing thing will disappear. Our goal will always be to help our students grow and learn. Thank you.
That's a nice summary of 8,000 feet, Erica. If anybody has any questions as to what Erica has just described, if not, I would move it on to Mr. Briggs.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everyone. I've broken this down into what are we doing to help our at-risk students, what types of summer support are we providing, and what our plan is for the upcoming fall school year. Recently, in recent weeks, we've returned a total of 11 students from the fully remote model to the hybrid model. These were, again, like Erica, we've met with multiple teams, special ed department, leadership teams, faculty to determine students that are struggling. I don't want to forget school counselor as well. Made a lot of phone calls, and we have returned in various grade levels, mind you, 6, 7, and 8, a total of 11 students that were really struggling mentally or academically. So they are now in that hybrid model. We too have provided extra supports using ed techs and our substitutes when available. Unfortunately, we had 8 staff members out in the last 2 weeks because of our recent shutdown. So that put a halt on some of our planning in the last few weeks because of a recent COVID case. Most of the models right now for interventions, we've attempted a pull-out model, which means some of the kids that have missed a lot of school, they come in for some instruction. We pull them out of study halls to try to get them extra support with our ed techs and our super sub. Recently, we've used Mr. Bell's high school students. Linda Lambert has reached out, including her own daughter and many high schoolers. So they're offering their time both during school and after school hours. You can see them at the 6th grade building, 7th and 8th grade building to offer support. And that has been super effective in the short term or immediate. We've offered office hours for struggling students with individual teachers for those supports outside of the classroom time. We talk a lot about academics, but we've got a lot of mental health struggles, students struggling. We've done home visits and food delivery, including our assistant principal, Mr. Hensby, if you're on tonight. He's doing a food delivery every Wednesday. We've had a lot of kids, students quarantined. So we deliver materials to their homes still. Leading into the summer supports, we've done a survey and we've got a group meeting on Wednesday to discuss our summer enrichment opportunities. This is both academic, social, and emotional. So there's a variety of things we would like to offer. And I want to thank Michelle Lake. She's been working with me to get this rolling. That group will meet Wednesday to provide a more clear-cut programming for our students this summer. Recently, Chad and I have met. I was involved in a meeting with him today about online platforms, remedial services for the summer. It could include unit recovery, standards recovery, kind of like, and that would be just for academics. So that is the recent research behind that. And then leading into the school year for the 2021-22 school year, one of the first steps is obviously collecting more data. Our DRAs, our second round of DRAs, were also scheduled 2 weeks ago when we had many staff impacted, so we had to reschedule that. But we have NWEAs coming up, and obviously our grades to determine truly where kids are at. So collecting more data is necessary. Like Erica stated, we too would like to add an intervention person built into both during school hours next year and after school hours with some of the funds that Peter will discuss shortly. And that would include transportation. That has seemed to be the barrier for a lot of our kids after school during quote unquote traditional normal school years. So some type of after school program that we could provide for those students. Again, this is academic, social, and emotional. We already said that one. And then a big piece next year with that intervention person is structured small group learning. So it would be in addition and support of the existing curriculum. Again, pulled during study halls, like Peter used the word accelerate, to accelerate the learning and not in place of the existing curriculum. So that's just a brief summary of the work that we've done at the junior high. Any questions?
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Mr. Bell.
All right, I don't want to say ditto to everything that Erica and Jason said, but there's a lot I could say ditto to about the process of, conversations with staff members and planning. So rather than just say ditto to everything, let me tell you what we're doing that's a little bit different. Some is the same. I think Jason talked about it a little bit about how him and I have had some conversations. What we first started looking at when we had the conversation about, okay, what is it that we can do if we can't get everybody back? The conversation quickly went to who are the students who may be struggling either academically or emotionally that our current method of instruction just isn't working for them. So if we can identify a small number, and starting with 5 to 10 students, if we can identify them, get them in more full time, then we can start doing that a little bit more. Let's see how it works for 5 to 10, and then expand upon that, and then expand upon that. So that's where we're at right now. We're in that, I think there's 8 to 10 right now, number of students that are now coming in every day. What it takes is having conversations, not just with the family, but with individual teachers. And then saying, okay, what are the barriers for that student coming back in your room? So maybe, there's one that needed a desk, but there was room for that. I anticipate as we grow upon this and invite more and more students back, we may start to run into where there's not enough desks in a classroom for a teacher. So what we might have to look into is where can we put that student in the building where they can learn remotely? Maybe it's a learning center. Maybe it's the library, where at least they're in the building for 3 of the 4 classes, and then they can have access to that other teacher as needed. So there's a lot of individual troubleshooting when it comes to that. One of the things I wanted to actually start off with, Peter had mentioned something about not only barriers, but what maybe some people might see in the community. Let me tell you a story about me as a parent. So we were at dinner one night, and we had just switched over to Orange Day classes, and my daughter was bringing up that in one of her classes there was only 3 students. And so it got me thinking, as a parent and taxpayer, and also as the building principal of, okay, if other people are in the same situation where there's 3 people sitting in their class, there's no doubt in my mind people are thinking, how come you can't bring the whole class back? If there's only 3, there's a lot of empty seats. So I went into IC the next day and I looked at the class roster, and it just happened in her cohort, there was 3 students. But in the other cohorts, there was 8, and 6. So the total, you're probably much quicker at math than me. It was like 18 to 20 kids total. So it's not like there's only 3 kids in the class. If you brought everybody back, 18, I couldn't fit 18 in that classroom. So it's a good thing just to kind of keep in mind, and I'm sure those conversations are being had around other people's dinner tables. So anyway, back to the return to school. A lot of troubleshooting on individuals to get them into classes, but there hasn't been anything that we've troubleshooted so far in that 8 to 10 students that we couldn't overcome. Our grades just closed a week ago. And so our final grades, we just got the report at the end of the week. Once we get through SATs with our juniors tomorrow, I have a meeting set up with both of my school counselors to sit down and look at that with Mr. Hensby as well, where we can start to look at, okay, now that we got that grade report and some of the grades have been done for the year, some have been done for a semester, we can really highlight maybe some kids that we need to try to bring back. At quick glance, it highlights that remote learners need to be back in school. And so it's going to open up those conversations where at least, even if we don't get those remote learners back, maybe we might get some of them back into hybrid and start to get them back into school a little bit more as well. So through that whole process, we tried to come up with different scenarios to use as a testing criteria, if you will, to identify certain students and who may be eligible to come back if asked. So we did come up with some different scenarios. Jason mentioned the conversation that we had with an online company that can help with remote learner. Part of that conversation was about summer school of, if we know that there's going to be a need for some students, how can we do it in an effective way to enhance student learning and reduce teacher stress of having to come up with learning plans for the summer or teachers teaching summer school? This company actually has a product that we can use with our remote learners in the future if needed and when needed. But they also have, as part of that, summer school support as well. We as a school can have complete control over what units our students are taking. So we could set up complete courses if needed. It could be, set up on individual units if needed. The company we're currently using, it's Edgenuity with Odysseyware. This new product is an offshoot of Odysseyware. I think it's a little bit better. It's called Courseware. And I think Earl's using it or has been introduced to it. So the main difference between Odysseyware and Courseware is there's live videos, and it's not so much reading. It's actually a little bit more interactive. The last thing is just looking at next year and how can we support students and accelerate their learning. Obviously, we need more data. We need more data, not just failure data for course remediation. I'm hoping that with the state adopting NWEAs, that will give us some really good baseline data, especially for our juniors. And then we're looking at, there's money in the budget to extend that to 9, 10, 11, and 12. So the whole school, we can start to get good data to assist us in looking at the classroom data, the assessment data, but gives us another point of emphasis. I do want to point out that last week there were several of us, K through 12, that met with Michelle Lake through the MCLA, the Main Curriculum Leaders Network, to look at math and look at K through 12. What is the data we want to collect? What could be our potential plan for action K through 12? One of the big topics of conversation last week was universal screeners. And I think Erica mentioned a lot about that in her budget presentations earlier this spring. Keith Martin did a lot of research, and he was really instrumental in that meeting last week, talking about the differences between a lot of those universal screeners. So I have a good feeling that whichever direction we go with universal screeners, it'll be K through 12 and we'll all be on the same board. And I think, I don't want to speak for Jason on this, but I think I'm going to lean heavily on Keith and his research. And if there's something that the elementary school's doing that extends K through 12, I think it would be foolish not to have those discussions and at least look at them as viable options. So. And if there's any questions, feel free to shout.
Jay and Earl have questions. Go ahead, Jay.
I love everything that I'm hearing. So great job, everybody. One thing that I would encourage you to consider is, as building principals know better than I, the first couple weeks of September are not very instructionally useful. Kids are learning how to get back into the school environment. Given that we have some students that essentially have been out of school for a year, I would encourage you, as you're planning your summer programs, to think about maybe an early start program of 3 or 4 days in late August or early September before other students start. Those that haven't been in school at all or very much for the last year, to give them a head start to start getting used to instruction. A little bit of math, read some short stories that you can process all the way through in a 3 or 4 day period. I think you're going to have a fair number of students who are going to find it traumatizing, if not traumatizing, at least stressful, the first few days back to school, and getting them in as a fairly small group for a few days and helping them acclimatize and get through some of those stressors right before school starts might not be a bad use of scheduling, for whatever it's worth.
Well, what comes to mind to me, Jay, as you mentioned that, is we tend to have our freshmen or whatever it was, 6th graders at the junior high at the time come in the day early because they're new to that building and new whatever. And it kind of leads to that where there's going to be a lot of people that are coming back like they're new if they haven't been in for quite some time. So that's kind of the thought that came to my mind as you were talking about it. So, yeah, it's an interesting concept. I saw a bunch of heads nodding. So that is definitely a concept for consideration if they haven't already.
Thanks, Jay.
Earl had his hand up as well. You muted, Earl.
Yep, muted. Love it. When are you guys planning on the NUIAs?
So do you want me to tell you the date that we originally picked? We picked April 27th and 28th.
Yeah, but I'm just
after
wondering.
training last week, I said there is no way we're pulling this off right after vacation. So
Are you planning on moving it to like the last week of school? That way, kids can turn in computers and do testing, and you're not losing that resource, the computer's resource. Because I imagine the IT department's going to want to collect their stuff back.
yeah, it's to be determined. We have to look at the AP schedule and make sure we're not interfering with that. So it'll either be the end of May, beginning of June. The further you go in June, the less likely the students are going to really take it serious. So I don't want to wait until too late in June, which is why we wanted to do it in April. But
after vacation.
Yeah.
I think John had a question.
I just was going to add to what Jay said, because I got thinking there's going to be like 4 groups of kids, 5 if you count some of your full-time at-home students that are coming back. But, 6th graders are going to be in a new building or a new section of the building. 7th graders will be in a new building. 9th graders, people coming back off of. So, Jay, I think that was a good point. I liked what he said, and I got thinking it's more than normal are going to be transitioning to a new building or a new situation. So, good idea.
Well, just to touch on that a little bit, John, before we get too far ahead, we don't know what our building configuration is going to look like in the fall if the spacing remains the same. So we have some hurdles we have to cross between now and then, but yeah, I think the sentiment is there for hoping to transition kids back in to whatever we end up with in the fall. We all hope that it's full-time education in our regular classrooms, but that's yet to be seen. So, but, and for those, I don't know if Jeff is aware, just to touch on it, for those of us who've been around a little longer, we had the NWEA testing years ago, pretty much at the elementary school. All testing has its strengths and weaknesses, but one of the big benefits of the NWEA test is that the results are not a year later like the state tests. You get them quick and you've got actionable information in a timely fashion, which is very, very helpful, and not like state exams that take a year before you end up knowing what it's trying to tell you. So just a little piece of information for those who aren't familiar with the NWEA tests. So any other questions or comments at this time? It seems to me we're working on some things we can work on for the end of the year, given the constraints that we're still within, that we have to deal with. And doesn't sound like the state has any intentions of changing those between now and the end of the year. And obviously, the information we'll discuss regarding the ESSER 3 funding might have some impact on what we're doing coming the fall, given that we don't know what the fall is yet. So,
Joel,
any other questions from anybody? Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to you and Peter. When we started this whole, all these meetings we've been part of with leadership and admin, and Peter talked about our belief statement, and we really stuck to that. And school safety, for Peter's always said from the get-go, and when doing these activities with our leadership teams and our faculty, the safety of our students and our staff has always been at the front of everything, and there's been no compromise with that. So I just want to say thank you, Joel, Peter, for your support. We've got a big building in that 6th grade building, but there's still 75 kids, 4 core teachers, not a lot of staff over there, and class sizes are, so when you look at all these elements, it may seem easy from the public eye, but I do appreciate your support and not compromising that word of safety, because that's important to our staff and our kids. So thank you.
Well, I guess I'll counter back. I'll just say thank you to all the administration and particularly all the staff of Winslow Schools, because it surely has been a difficult year. We still got a little ways to go yet in this year, but we as board members have done what we can do to support you, but you guys have had to carry the water on a lot of things on a daily basis, and it surely has not been an easy thing. And in my conversations with Peter and texts and emails on whatever it is on weekends and nights and all the times, because you always tend to get your COVID cases on weekends. So now you're working all weekend doing contact tracing and all those sorts of things that just add to the regular workload of teaching, on top of the hybrid situation as it is, which creates another dynamic altogether. So again, thank you to everybody and all the staff and teachers of Winslow Schools, because it's not easy, but you guys are you're making your way through it as well as can be expected, I guess, given the circumstances. So thank you all. I will say, if I could, just to lead into what next year, I mean, I've kind of touched on a little bit. We don't know what the schools, the social distancing requirements are going to be by then. We all hope we're back to normal, but and all the things that we're talking about for this year that we're limited to, but with the ESSER 3 funding, as we get into that discussion, that frees up some resources. That money was specifically, or especially a portion of that was specifically intended for some some resources to try to gain back some of the losses that this year has had. And I just want to, while we get into that, I just want to touch on, for anybody who's tuning in who's not adept to what's been going on. I mean, well, why didn't we have more classrooms? Why didn't we have more teachers and all those other things? And I just wanted to touch on, obviously, getting teachers. Everybody has the same issue. So just gaining more teachers to put into more classrooms is no small feat. Additionally, the money that was made available to us to make that happen had significant restrictions on it, both from a timing and other restrictions basis, where we couldn't just go out and fill up every available space with a teacher, even if you could find one, because of the way the resources that were provided to us from the federal programs through the state, the restrictions that were there. Pretty much tied our hands on how we could use funds for certain things. So just to kind of reiterate that a little bit for anybody who's tuning in that might not understand why we are where we are, but as we get discussing the ESSER 3 funding, there's some other opportunities that come up that we haven't had in the past. So I don't know if anybody else has any questions, but that's the next topic as we get into new business. If nobody else has any questions or comments. Okay, hearing none. I guess, Peter, why don't you lead us into new business with information on ESSER 3 funding?
Okay. Where do I begin? Joel, you touched upon some of the funds that we've already received and that we've already purchased, things such as personal protective equipment, cleaning supplies, instructional materials, online teaching resources, technologies, outdoor equipment, teachers, school buses. So the money that we received was originally to try to get schools open and try to keep them going. Like you said, Joel, they had timelines and it had to be spent at a certain time. We rushed to meet the deadlines. No one could meet the deadlines, and they realized that. Then they extended the deadlines. So there was a first pot of money, and that needs to be expended by June of 2021, and we will meet that deadline, so we won't have lost any of those funds that we were eligible to receive, that we had to write projects for, that needed to be approved, that needed to follow certain rules and guidelines. So that's all good. So now we continue to move forward. I don't know about the rest of you, but when you think about something that needs to be done, people think about things in different ways. I'm one of these individuals that tends to think about a process they call backwards planning, where you begin with the end in mind and then you work your way through it. So think of a typical school year. Those of you who have experienced starting up a school year understand the tremendous amount of work that goes into it, from scheduling, from bus routes, from feeding, from hiring teachers, hiring instructors, all of the components that go into a school year to get that thing running so that first day everything runs smoothly is a massive task for any school district to undertake. That's in a normal year. So here we go. We've received another round of funds that can be used until 2024. That frightens me just a little bit, because on the first round of funds, they said you've got to have a lot of this money spent by December of 20, which means they really wanted you to put a big push in and get schools up and running. But 2024 scares me a little bit, and here's why. Go back a year, March. We're told schools are shutting down. Everybody's thinking, clearly, this is going to be 2 weeks. This is going to be a 2-week thing. 2 weeks goes by. We're told another 2 weeks. Clearly, we're thinking, oh, this can't be. Surely we're going to be back in school. This goes on until the end of the year. We don't come back, as you all remember. We get into the summer. We're told, have 3 options for coming back to school. Plan 3 different ways. We do. We end up in this hybrid model, which is very confusing, because on the one hand, you hear a lot of the decisions are local control, but on the other hand, you hear the word requirement. And when you hear requirement, it takes away a lot of local control. And by the way, I will echo everything that Jason said and all of you have said about working as a team, because we never could have gotten this far if we hadn't. Kudos to the teachers, every single building. They cover for each other right now, because most days we don't have enough people to cover the classes that we need. And they're doing without taking their breaks or their study. They're giving up their planning periods. Kudos to the staff for what they're doing. That's what's keeping us open. So pick up the paper. And I know I'm going all over the place right now, but there are a lot of pieces to this. Pick up the paper. All right. You've got our neighboring school a little bit further north of us is shut down because they can't find enough teachers. 13, 15 teachers are quarantined. Go a little bit to the west of us. That whole school district is shut down as well because they can't find bus drivers and they have cases and outbreaks. You don't have to go far to understand that this pandemic is still with us and the cases continue to grow. It hasn't gone away. So when I make phone calls to Department of Education and I speak to personnel there and I say, what do you think about next year? What do you think? And I'm told, hang on, we're not sure. There's no definitive answer. Are the guidelines going to go away? We can't say anything yet. We have to wait. Then I start asking myself questions. What about the vaccinations? How's that going to play in? When everybody's vaccinated, we have herd immunity, is that going to help us? So there's a lot of stuff that's just flowing around out there. So once again, when you say begin with the end in mind, and this is a question for this board because this is important. My question to you is it important to have all kids in school for everyday learning as much as we possibly can get them in school for everyday learning? I'm going to assume that the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then that becomes a criteria for us is how do we get as many kids back to everyday learning next year? If the guidelines go away, it's almost a piece of cake at this point because it's back to normal. If the guidelines don't go away, and right now we don't know if the guidelines are going to go away or not, but we can't just sit here and say, oh, well, I guess we'll wait to see. We have got to make some plans right now, even though we don't know what the end is going to look like. We don't know. So we have to consider various scenarios, so to speak. We've already talked about how do we help kids for the rest of this year, this summer, and next year. But what we don't know is what next year is going to look like from day one. Assuming the guidelines are still in place, we need space. So this year we have the 6th grade at the junior high. If we want to get, and I'm going to use the elementary school as an example, if we want to get all kids at the elementary school back every day next fall, we're going to need the space that we have at the junior high plus some in order for that to happen, plus additional teachers in order for that to happen. Right now, that junior high. There are some great conversations going on about repurposing that building and using it for a different reason, which is outstanding for this community, which is great. If that goes through, the question becomes, would that building be available to us? And if so, when and how much of it would be available to us? Because we certainly don't want to stand in the way of progress of another organization coming in and doing something with that building that would be great for this community. But for us, there's a part of us that says, well, we don't really know if we need that building, but I think the other part of us had better say, if we can secure some space in that building, we probably should say we're very interested in doing that to be safe, because we want our kids to come back, and that having that space is one way that can happen. So that's one thought that we're thinking about. Okay, what if that building goes away? What if something happens and we don't have any space in that building? Now the thought turns to, what else do we have available? I contacted St. John's today to see what the availability of that facility might be for us. They too are in the process of doing something different with St. John's and Mount Mercy, and that may not be available to us or anyone for that matter. So that is kind of off the table right now. Shelley and I have had conversations about modular units. What would it take to get modular units here so that we could set those up? What's the cost? How would that work? So we're having conversations about doing that. So we are exploring the various avenues that we need to explore right now in order to see what would it cost to make this happen and how do we make this happen. So I think it's something that folks need to know. We're having those conversations right now because we don't know what next fall is going to bring, but we're under the assumption that one of our main goals is to get as many kids back to school full-time every day as possible, especially at the elementary level. So I'll stop right there before I keep going, because I saw that John had his hand up.
Well, I'm just going to input the way I understood. I'm on the committee that is talking about what we're going to do with the junior high. And while KVCAP has many plans in the works, it sounded like they were going to be very, very flexible for us, at least for a 12-month period. Now, when that 12 months starts and when it ends, it sounded a little hazy because nothing's in stone, but it sounded like the flexibility of the next school year might be given to us to decide for ourselves. I couldn't tell you for sure that's a given, but it sounded very likely that KVCAP would be flexible because their plans are not to break ground until the spring. In other words, after next school year would be over. So it sounded very flexible and very possible. That number one. And then number two, just to throw out a wild idea, because I lived through a situation in a school where we had a series of bomb scares, one right after another, and the community came together and decided we're not going to have anyone push us out of our schools in this way. They said, we're going to send the kids to alternate sites, and they used churches, they used the VFW, they used any buildings in the area that were open and possible places. So, I mean, if you're going to think about using St. John's Catholic School, perhaps there's other buildings in town that might be maybe not acceptable, but in an emergency situation, maybe we have other, I know the VFW is big enough for a classroom. Some of the churches are big enough. There's all kinds of creative ways to do things. So That's my input.
Right. Thanks, John.
Um,
And I hope you're right on the timeline for the project, because that would allow a lot of us to sleep a lot better at night, knowing that we have a pathway to pursue and really put our energies in right now. So that would be great. So if there are no other points, I'll keep going with some thoughts here.
I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind, Peter, and as many conversations we have, this hasn't popped in my head before, and obviously it's not a easy thing to do. But going back to the days of the '60s, I guess, with all the baby boomers kids coming along through high school, that they did double sessions where they split in half the number of students were in a building at a time that way. Obviously, I think the idea of some of the cleaning requirements have probably lessened a little bit from when they first thought with this pandemic, but still that complicates it a little bit versus just space that they did back in the double session days. But I don't know how that would work exactly, but just kind of popped into my head from days gone by when all that happened. And I know my parents lived through that. So my grandfather was superintendent when they did that. So
yeah, we actually considered that during this year and looked at what were some of the barriers. Of course, transportation was one. And at the time, we were looking at, how do we not, even though there's nothing that's not going to impact parents, but how do we not, impact parents a half a day here, a half a day there? But that suggestion, Joel, is not something that is necessarily off the table if we have to look at all scenarios, and that could be a scenario that we look at. So
We'd have to consider staff. I think that would be the main drawback, because have the personnel in place to make double sessions happen would be a total change in our consideration towards the contract.
everything that we do has tentacles attached to it, and that's what I mean about the backwards planning in a situation like this. Is just really difficult because it all has barriers and tentacles attached.
And going back to your previous starting point, we don't know what the fall is going to be. So
That is correct.
we don't know what target we're aiming at yet.
That is correct. So if you continue with the funding, so there's a CARES 2, which is funding that is upon us right now that we have not applied for yet and submitted. We need to. So that's a little over $1 million. That's 1.1. And the priorities for that money include staffing and spacing. Staffing and spacing. And then there's the ESSER 3, which is the notification that we just received. And that's 2.5 million available for Winslow. 20% of that, or roughly $500,000 of that, needs to be used for remediation types of activities. The other tricky part to this, and this is where it gets very confusing for a lot of folks, none of this money can be used to take things out of your budget or pay for things in your budget, because that's not the intent of it. It's to be used for COVID-related activities, whether you hire new teachers, whether you add space so that you can have more space, those types of things. What you don't want to do is put yourself in a situation where you're purchasing things that are not one-time cost, and you create a hole in your budget so that you're going to have a cliff in a year or 2 years from now that you're not going to have this funding to support you with. And I'm looking at Jay right now, and his eyes are getting bigger because he knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's a very frightening place to be. So this is where I need some guidance from you folks, because these are just thoughts. We know right now that our elementary school is tight for space. We're efficient. I can look at it two ways. I can say something positive, and I can say we're efficient, we're utilizing all of the space. And I can also say that we're tight for space. We could use some additional rooms. Because let's face it, Winslow is a pretty nice place. And Kyle keeps talking about in-migration, that young families are trying to come to Winslow because they know it's a nice place. They want to be here. They want their families to be here. They want their kids to be here. So if we continue with in-migration and we continue to grow, you're going to want to have space. And you have an opportunity right now where you have these funds that can be utilized to create space. So you would have an opportunity to use these funds to do that. So when I go back to what I just said to you about the CARES 2 and the efforts, the ESSER 2 and the ESSER 3, if you look at those two amounts that I just read to you that we still need to apply for, that comes up to a total of about $3,600,000. Now, out of that, 500,000 or so needs to be used specifically for some of the things that we talked about. So that leaves you with $3,100,000. In preliminary conversations with the architect, they think that you could probably add 4 rooms, some space to the elementary school for around $2 million. So that would leave you with $1,100,000 to do all the things that we talked about tonight, about buying extra people, about renting space, about having modular units, whatever it would take to get next year rolling, assuming we can find the space. So this is one way where you look at it and you can say, can you get everybody back in, and can you utilize some of this money to add more space because you know that you need it? Because if you go back to John's conversation, let's say everything works out and the stars align and we're able to utilize some of the old junior high again next year, and that project comes to fruition and it's going great. So the following year, the junior high is being repurposed to something. We no longer have that space there, but we would have expanded on the elementary school, giving us more classrooms for additional space for that building at no cost to the taxpayer. So these are the things that are playing through my mind and all of our minds in terms of how do we move forward. And so I really need some feedback, some input from all of you in terms of how would you like us to utilize these funds that we probably are never going to see again. This is one-time funding that I've never seen in 40 years of my educational career, and who knows if we're ever going to get this opportunity again. John.
I know John has his hand up. Before he starts, though, I just want a little bit of history for some of the newer members to our board. That, I mean, when we went to a 2-school system, I mean, this was a multi-year process of getting to where we ended up. And yeah, John's got 10 fingers up there. So what we ended up with, given the resources that were available to us financially with our 2-school system, was the most cost-efficient model as far as space that we could come up with that was going to serve the needs of classroom space as well as the other space that was needed for phys ed and other needs. So basically what it came down to is there is not an extra classroom anywhere, because we squeaked out every dollar we had to build what we had. There was not extra. And so that's why we are where we are. There was a certain belief, given the declining school age population, that and yes, our numbers had gone down, but as Kyle has spoken to on many times, the increasing in migration of students at the younger age. And I think you're going to also see, along with that, since there's not a lot of new construction going on, the turning over of older houses in Winslow from older residents to families is likely to occur and even increase. So, to my opinion, I mean, having space for the future, I think, is something we definitely need to look at. But I wanted to give a little bit of a layout of how we ended up where we are and why we didn't really plan for that then, because we got all we could out of the dollars we've got, given also construction costs were booming through the roof at the time, between the time we were planning and the time we actually built. So anyway, just a little synopsis there. I know John had his hand up, so go ahead, John.
Okay, one of the things that Peter said earlier in the meeting was about planning backwards. And one of the things that, if you sat through all those meetings like we did for the building committee for the new junior high school, one word kept coming up that worked out in a very positive way for us, but it also could have been a lot worse, and that is the word contingency. And I wonder how the word contingency would fit into the planning of a new room or whatever amount of space that we decide for the elementary school, meaning we both have to be ready for contingencies of change in price, anything that occurs that might not be on the radar. We were very fortunate with the junior high that more of the contingency money wasn't used, but in my point of view, with COVID going on, and with the way gas prices are going up, and with the way building material prices are going up, building a big contingency might be wise. And if worst case scenario, we end up like we did with the junior high and spending that contingency on finishing out some plans. So all I would say is, if we're going to plan backwards, don't forget, and I know the architects do this anyway, it's built into the process, but I would think that it might even be worthwhile to have a little bit higher percentage contingency for the unknown in this time of COVID.
Well, I guess I would speak to that a little bit, given the experience I had with the last project. Is I agree with you wholeheartedly, because obviously construction costs are going up. They continue to do that. Given that this project would be a shorter length project and much smaller in scope and very little interaction with the existing facility, it's mostly new construction addition. I wouldn't think there'd be a lot of surprises in regards to the old building, but I think the construction cost is the larger contingency. I would think that if we had the same construction management company that we had last time, or if that's not possible, if somebody of the same caliber that did the work that they did, they saved us a bunch of money. They give us firm prices, and when we signed the contract, we knew what we were getting and how much we were going to pay for it on a maximum price point. So I think we could probably nail down the monetary aspect of that before we even start. So I guess is what I'd say. With obviously a certain amount of contingency, but I think it's far more limited than the scope of the last project, which was significantly more money. Any other questions?
Jay has his hand up.
Oh, yes, he does. Go ahead, Jay.
As we've talked about the idea of adding space to the elementary school, we've talked about how this will eventually serve our need anyway. But what I haven't really heard is an articulation of how would this year have been different if we had 4 more classrooms at the elementary school. I don't have a picture in my mind, because if we do go into next fall with the same limitations, the spacing limitations of people, I'd like to have a picture of how we would have done it differently if we had 4 rooms, because that's the picture of what next year looks like. And that would help us answer the question, would we still need space in the junior high? Or do we talk to the National Guard about creating temporary spaces in the fall? They certainly have that capacity unless somebody else is using it. So that would help me if maybe Peter, you could help, or Erica, with what could we accomplish if nothing else changed and we had 4 more classrooms. What would we be able to do, and what would we still not be able to do?
It's kind of two parts to your question, I think, and I'll try to get to the first part. And again, there's an unknown. So embedded in your question, if we still had the old junior high for next year, okay, if we still had the old junior high and we could plan for that, and you decided that using some of this money would be in the best interest to increase space, then next fall, hopefully the construction would start. The impact to that building would be that you've got all of your kids in the old building still. So now fast forward to the following year, which is 2 years from now. Now, I think what I'm hearing you say, what if in 2 years from now, we're still at this 3-foot social distancing scenario, which is a possibility. It's a possibility. I mean, when somebody puts a price tag out there and says 2024, they're thinking, because on a national level, some schools across the nation are 2 years behind us because they haven't had a day of remote learning yet. So it's a possibility. So what happens 2 years from now? So could we get everybody in with 4 additional classrooms at the elementary school and with some of the areas that we have now? That's a question that it's a good question. If we had remote learners who would still want to take advantage of that situation, and it would reduce our size enough so that could happen, that might help us. So we would have to look at our existing space right now, and I think if I'm not mistaken, I think we could probably squeeze a classroom, maybe 2 areas out of our existing space, and depending on how the new wing would start to be configured. So you might have 6 areas, 6 spaces that you could use, which might be getting us closer to having all kids in there. The other piece to be thinking about is that, and right now it's all conversation, but there's another potential round of funds later for infrastructure, which is something that you may want to take advantage of as well in the future. So there's just a lot in the air right now in terms of what could we do.
Nate has his hand up.
I'm just thinking out loud. I love the idea of adding on to the elementary school. I mean, we're so efficient, it's really hurting us now. The modulars, I'm not a huge fan of. I mean, it's sort of like a necessary evil to get kids back in school. But I feel like it's money wasted, especially if we go 2, 3, 4 years. You're talking about a huge price tag, whether we're paying for it or not. And I don't know the plans of the addition. Is this a 2-story addition or 1-story addition?
It would be a 2-story, Nate. What they would do is they would take the footprint, because that building was originally designed to have an extra wing. So they would take that footprint of where that wing would have been, and they would so it would be an upstairs and a downstairs, so that if you ever wanted to continue with it, you would just keep adding blocks blocks onto it so that eventually you have the wing that it was originally designed for if you needed it.
So I'm glad you said that. I was thinking about if we spent the money on the ground floor, down the road, we could build up, and I hesitate to say this because I know material costs are shooting through the roof. We could build up much cheaper. Would that make sense? I'm just throwing ideas out there, saying, you know, we go out, whatever, six rooms on the ground floor, but design it as if we can build up on the new wall. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I think, you know, we should have conversations with the architect about that, Nate. And bring
I agree with the population's only increasing. I mean, I just met 2 new kids in my neighborhood in the last 3 days. One's from Waterville and one is from down south and needs a pre-K packet. So I really don't think we're a declining population like some of us might want to think. Not necessarily this group, but. So I'm just thinking down the road. And like you said, this is a long-term investment. Setting us up for the future, I guess. Thank you.
Earl had his hand up.
Oh, and I'm actually off mute. Yes. Okay. 2 thoughts. A, hasn't cold storage been a issue? I think I can remember Chad at one point saying something about wanting to have additional storage space for material that you want to keep, but you don't necessarily need to get your hands on it tomorrow. And if that's the case, then maybe some kind of a consolidated cold storage location might be worthwhile thinking about. The second one is, what about the 4-year-old program? This seems like an opportunity to increase the 4-year-old program, increase the size of the 4-year-old program as far as their physical spacing, which then leads to drawing people in and feeding that program.
You are 100% correct. If you had the additional classrooms, you could increase the 4-year-old program, which is also a revenue generator for you as well. So you are 100% correct.
Now, would the 4 rooms that are being just kicked around, 4 seems to be the baseline that's here, those 4 rooms, presuming that spacing goes back to normal spacing within 18 to 24 months, would those 4 rooms be sufficient to house the 6th grade and the 4-year-old program?
If spacing is normal?
Yes.
Erica's nodding her head yes. I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It also obviously depends on how many kids we get. I think I've heard multiple times here, we keep getting a lot of kids. And it's true, we have lots of new kids each year. So yes, I think that would give us the opportunity to expand the 4-year-old program. And, you know, the space was planned to have 6th grade here. And so that is, the space still exists to have them here if we were in normal times. So it would allow us probably some more flexibility to increase the 4-year-old program and have room in the event that we needed it in the future for another classroom. But definitely in the non-real world, you know, when space is an issue, those spaces would be vital.
Yeah, I guess I would just, I think Erica just kind of touched on that, but just to make it clear, and what I'm thinking anyway is that as much as I think the 4-year-old program is the place to go in the future, I think until we get our regular spacing back, we need every space we have just to take care of our current population with COVID spacing requirements. So, but once we get beyond that, then a commitment to a 4-year-old program seems to make sense. But obviously we need the space to do it.
I think it's important to just note that, you know, we're saying 4 classrooms, but that's a conversation that, you know, Shelley and I went over to the elementary school, looked at the wing and said, you know, what seems to make sense? Can you build it out? bump it out in blocks. When I had an initial conversation with Doug Breer, the architect who did the work, kind of said the same thing. Do you want to do it in blocks? That way you can just add to it if you ever needed more space. You don't have to destroy the roof line. You just keep going out with it, kind of thing. But and I say 4, who knows? Perhaps they could lay this out and maybe it would be 5 rooms. It's a pretty good chunk of space when you start looking at the size up there. So it could be more than that just by bumping it out. But that's I guess what I'm saying is we haven't had any in-depth conversations with anyone about start drawing, start doing stuff until we get a sense from the board. Is this a good idea? Is this something that we should pursue?
Kyle has his hand up, I believe.
Like follow the procedure is why aren't the ones who aren't coming back? And the other thing is, we're going to have to at some point work on where are the.
I know too, Peter. Also, Doug Breer, when we talked about this, he mentioned the possibility, along with those 4 classrooms, there may be an opportunity to add like some small conference rooms or office space in that area too. So, that there's a whole possibility with that addition. It's not just limited to just strictly 4 classrooms because of the area that we're going to access. So, some of the things that we've been looking at too.
Thank you, Shelley.
Al, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. I thought I heard Jay ask the question in his question. One of his aspects of the question was, how would we have managed this year with the space that we had allocated? And I think what we've learned, there's a couple things. One is our enrollment did not go in the direction that was predicted when this whole, we started in December 2012 on what to do with the junior high and get to where we are now with these configurations. And I did, as Peter pointed out, never completely agreed with the enrollment projections. And we, last 3 years, kindergarten in particular has been larger than what the birth rate was the previous 5 years. So I believe 2 years ago, we added a kindergarten teacher. I'm going from memory here, but I think we added a kindergarten teacher to our numbers. And then last year, we added both a first and a second grade teacher. So in this building construction period, basically, we used up 3 classrooms that on the floor print, the blueprint, we originally said, oh, we've got some space in here that will meet some of these other needs. And so the enrollment drove us to use up some of these rooms. And as we've been scratching our heads and trying to figure out what to do with other things and how childcare fits in and these possibilities of 4-year-old program, if we'd have had to, we'd have probably figured out how to do it if we didn't have the physical spacing thing, but we still would have been very tight. And we lost the opportunity to have presenters, a space for presenters to come in because we were using a couple of classrooms for that kind of stuff. People like Elsie Bates coming in or the planetarium and that sort of thing. So those are some things, plus just some conference room space, which has already been mentioned. The other thing I will toss out there, nobody's been talking about this since the pandemic began, and I don't know where this sits, maybe Peter knows. But at one time there was some serious talk about CDS services being taken over by school systems, and that has to have a space, even though those kids won't be coming into school to be enrolled. If we're providing those services, if that ever were to come to be, where would that happen? So that's forward thinking, but just some. I hope that answers what I thought I heard was a question about how did we get to this place and what would we have used had we not been in a pandemic.
I think John had his hand up next.
Yes, I actually agree with Nate's point. I don't love temporary classrooms, things that are going to be thrown up, money thrown into the wind. But maybe with the exception, take Earl's idea and Nate's reluctance to have temporary classrooms, which I agree with. If there was a block of 4 classrooms and a possible temporary classroom that later could be adapted to be cold storage, maybe you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone and have a storage building in the future once COVID's over. Just throwing out ideas.
That's an interesting concept. I don't know if anybody else has discussed it, but we always think of modular classrooms in the sense of a two-piece thing being hauled in and put together, but be thinking about it differently into something that could later be used for storage is interesting concept. So I think that's a good idea. I guess, well, Jay has his hand up. I got something I'll add later, but go ahead, Jay.
I think there's a risk in building onto the elementary school at this time. We're all trying to be fiscally conservative. We're all trying to take the long-term view to think about the 4-year-old program, etc. But we're looking beyond the problem that is the one that faces us right now. The problem that faces us right now is September. It's not a year from September. It's not when CDS decides to join the school, although we need to be aware that's an ongoing discussion. The question is, in September, how would we educate our students? I would hate to see that next year we were doing the same thing we're doing now, every other day, hybrid model, when we're spending $2 million on a project that's not going to help us until the following year. I think that, it might be fiscally sound, but it might not be educationally appropriate. I don't like temporary classrooms either, but I'd rather spend money on a temporary classroom than have our students have another whole year where they have to be in a hybrid situation because we had $2 million worth of federal money. And instead of solving September's problem, we were trying to solve the problem of 3 to 5 years from now as we continue to grow in population.
Understood. Earl, you had your hand up, Earl?
Yeah, I was gonna, I disagree with that because I think that if you only aim at the short-term problem, then every problem becomes a short-term problem. Because as soon as you get done dealing with the problem 1 year out, you didn't look 2 years out, now you're 1 year out from that 2-year problem. I agree that hybrid sucks. Trust me, from the teaching perspective, hybrid sucks. You don't get to see the kids. You don't get the body language. You don't get the immediate feedback to know whether it's working or not. All of that is gone. And I don't want to do it next year. But to think that we would have an opportunity to set ourselves up a year from now, knowing that potentially, and a lot of this is what ifs, knowing that we will probably still be able to use the junior high, I think that we're missing an opportunity. And we're missing an opportunity to ensure that we're growing in a fiscally responsible manner, which this town needs.
Well, I think I'll take an opportunity to jump in here if I could. I definitely hear what Jay's saying and Earl's saying and everybody. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and Peter can chime in, I think we're looking at, in my mind, I think the way to go is all the above. Weigh what the resources are, but given the chunk of money that we have in front of us, if the addition is $2 million, that still leaves 1.6, of which half a million of that has to go to remedial or whatever it's termed to help get kids caught back up. So that still leaves some money that could go through to modulars in the short term, because I very much agree. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, tell me if I'm wrong, I think everybody wants to get our kids, the first priority has to get our kids back in school full time and find the space to do it. Is that, I guess go there is step one for me in the short term, to Jay's point. And then to Earl's point, look at the resources for the long term of the addition and other things that we might be needed for multiple reasons, but the fact that we might even not even have available to us to junior high the following year, and this would help relieve some of that burden with some long-term space if this goes on beyond even the next school year. That gives us some long-term investment, maybe that in conjunction with some of the short-term investment that might be required to get our kids back to school, full-time in the next school year. So that's kind of what I'm looking at is what do we need to do to get our kids? I think this is what Peter's looking at, so I don't want to say it's me. I think this is what the discussion is what do we need to do to get our kids full-time back in school first? And then what money can we put toward long-term solutions so that we don't have to, we have some flexibility for the future if we have to continue to do this, or then being able to have resources that will serve us well in the long term. Obviously, finding space, then you also need teachers to go with that space. So that's kind of what I'm reading into this. I know I kind of want to move the conversation along a little bit if we could, just because I know Peter wanted to get to the council meeting, and we're already pushing 7 o'clock, but I see some heads nodding and things like that. John has hand up. Go ahead, John.
I agree with both Earl and Jay, because I think this is an awkward thing to say because you can't really picture it, but we got to take 2 first steps. We got to step into the future with 1 foot, and we have to step into the full-time. So in other words, we're going to take our left foot and go into the taking care of the kids and getting them back full-time, and depending on the COVID situation. But our other foot is going to take the same step at the same time into the future. So you're taking 2 first steps, and I think Joel described it well. Both have to be done, and it may be a little awkward and a little extra work, but some kind of hybrid of a hybrid, be it double sessions or using the old junior high or some shuffling of all those ideas to get this to work. But Jay's right. We need to get the kids back to school. I'm hoping it's because COVID's over, but if not, we have to find a way. But we also have to plan for the future, which is what Earl was saying. So I think they're both correct, and just you've got to take both steps.
Peter, do you want to weigh in on where did I speak out of turn there, or you got some other thoughts on?
No, I commend all of you because everything that you just said, I mean, if I listen to what Jay just said and I listen to what Earl just said, those are the conversations I'm having by myself inside my head. I mean, that's exactly where I'm at. And so that's why I'm reaching out to all of you saying, here are the complications of this. And I'm looking, I mean, I can recommend, I mean, my recommendation is absolutely, we want to get all kids back in school. My recommendation also is let's look to the future because we have an opportunity to do that. And can we do both? Is really where I'm at. I would hate to lose the opportunity to look to the future. And I certainly we don't want to do something that's not going to allow all kids to come back. And I don't want to be negative, but $2 million wouldn't have got us back this year because you couldn't build 2 buildings to accommodate all the kids that we needed to accommodate. You know, Chad and Jason are looking into a remote learning program that would probably be instrumental if you had a lot of students who chose that route because it would allow others to come back. Now, some students might like that route, but you know, it's a combination of a lot of things that's going to make this work. It's not going to be necessarily one thing. It's a lot of things. But yeah, I'm right where all of you are right now, and so we're just looking at from a standpoint of having some direction because some decisions need to be made in terms of how do we start to move this thing forward. Some pieces need to start falling into place. Now, I've reached out to Erica, the town manager. I've asked her about, you know, what are the possibilities of having that building? She's going to reach out to the committees and kind of explain the dilemma that we're in to try to get some answers. So we have a lot of wheels rolling, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So it seems to me that the steps in the short term is to find the space and the resources you need to bring everybody back, because obviously the addition isn't going to be there for the current school year. I think we have to work on the assumption that we're going to still have spacing, and I assume, so that's the first steps, which is obviously not small steps by any means. And then hopefully there's resources left over to be thinking further down the road.
Correct. And to Jay's point, this is a scary one. To Jay's point, what if you get through this thing next year, worst case scenario, and you're still at 3 feet, so we've got to do what we've got to do. And then we go into the following year and we're still at 3 feet. That's still a problem if you don't have enough kids doing remote learning at the junior high school, because you still might not be able to get all kids in here now. Now I can sit here and I can say, oh, come on, really? 2 more years? But that's what I said last year when they said March, 2 weeks. And I said, come on, really? 2 more weeks? And we never came back. So I'm not doubting anything anymore. So this is one of those situations where we want to make sure we plan for all angles of this thing.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say also, the option of having space at the elementary school, if the old junior high is only available for a year, or KV Cap pulls the plug on the project, it doesn't, seems to me, to the long-term good of the town, we don't want to blow that project up by extending another year into the junior high that they want to be able to proceed, and to blow that up over a short-term need doesn't make any sense to me. So
exactly,
I think we got to try to move forward so we don't have the need of that building is I think the longer-term thing. And if we get another year in there, I think that's great. Great option to have, but I don't know if we can plan on much longer than that unless we're going to blow that project up is what I'm thinking.
And here's some positive. Let's think really positive here. We could hear in a month from now, we're coming back next fall to normal. Now, trying to be positive, but it's a possibility. 2 months from now, who knows? We don't know.
So I guess, Jay, is your hand still up or up again?
I apologize, but yes, it is. All of this makes sense, and I just want to push back a little bit on John's analogy of taking 2 first steps, because I do think we have to decide what is our core mission. And our core mission is to look at those first graders this year who have had half a year of normal education and then a year and a half. And our high school seniors this year who have essentially had a year and a half of disrupted education. I think our first priority has to be that we can educate the students that we've got in September. I want to see a plan for that. And when that plan still has $2 million available for us, then I want to say, okay, we've solved the first problem and we have the opportunity for $2 million more dollars. That we really need to take the opportunity to address future needs. But I was feeling a little bit like the conversation was spending more time on the future needs and less on what I see as a more immediate crisis. I wish there wasn't an immediate crisis. I wish we could focus just on the long term. But for me to be comfortable with voting on steps forward, I need to feel comfortable with the plan for September. And then no one's going to be happier than me if we've still got $2 million available.
Jay, not to
something that's going to help us 5 and 10 and 20 years down the road.
Yep, not to throw a damper on what you just said, Jay, but I would agree with you 100%. But here's the damper that's still hanging out there. So even if you go with that plan, which I think is a good one, because that I think we could do that. The question that remains is what happens on the second year if we're still in this situation. But you've positioned yourself to be in a better position for the future for many years to come at that point. So at that point, you've positioned yourself for many years to come, and you have to overcome, how do you get those other kids in for hopefully another year? At perhaps a fraction of the cost that's going to cost you right now, because you've got all of the kids that you've got to worry about.
I agree. I definitely hear what Jay's saying, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, everybody is on the same page of figuring out what we got to do to get our kids back full time next fall. But I think on this, we have to take the step, or else it won't be ready. I think we also got to start some preliminary planning on the addition possibility to so that when we determine, because I mean, in a couple of months from now, we're going to have a plan for fall, because if we're going to have the space, we've got to have that locked down. I mean, if we're looking at modules, if we're looking at the junior high, I mean, everybody else is going to be doing the same thing. So we've got to decide, we got to lock those things down. And so in a couple of months from now, we're going to know what resources we're going to use toward those efforts, by and large, at least on a macro level. And then hopefully we'll have a better idea with a preliminary plan for an addition possibility, and whether or not the net sum of those two costs work to the resources available. So I think they're kind of independent, but parallel, but independent pieces, I say, for where we are right now. I see Peter nodding, so I don't know if anybody else has anything else to add, but I think we're kind of at a point where we're all kind of nodding the same thing. I don't see, I know Jeff is here somewhere. I haven't heard anything out of Jeff. Jeff, did you have any questions or comments?
Nope, not this time. I think all the conversation is good. I agree with everything you guys are saying. I think expanding on the school for the future is good. I mean, I'd like to add 6 classrooms if possible. I mean, if you could add a class to every grade in the school and reduce the class sizes, I think that would be a huge bonus if that was possible one day in the future. But yeah, I'm on board with definitely expanding the school, and then also meeting the challenge of next year, whether it's through adding the additional pods or taking advantage of some of the space at the junior high. I don't understand, is the junior high completely being used up on daycare and the what's there, 6th graders? Is the whole facility being used?
It's
used
just
up?
6th grade and childcare there currently. So no, they're not using all the space, but of
Because
course,
why couldn't you use some of the money to, if you had to, instead of the pods, maybe even just making some upgrades to that school to make it the whole thing usable, if that's the problem.
Well, I mean, I think Shelley could speak to this a little more, but I mean, the building was usable to a certain level when we left, but obviously it's not a long-term solution given the age of the building. But would we use that versus to its fullest extent versus, not bring our kids back? Yeah, I think we would surely do that. I guess the question is, we've got to find out as how much of the space would be available to us. And of course, there's going to be the associated cost of heats, lights, and power and so forth for that building, which we've had this year, but it would be at a greater level if we used more of the building. And but that would be, compared to the cost of bringing in modulars or something like that,
I mean, it's something
you
that
know,
you could evaluate to see which would be more cost effective, putting $1 million into the junior high, or how many pods it gets you, or modules, $1 million get you. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've talked about the expenses for the junior high for quite some time, so I think we got a reasonable handle on what kind of shape it's in and what, obviously long-term expenses would be for the building, but how operational it is in the short term. But obviously, I think as Peter touched on before, I mean, for example, to get K-8 back with spacing, with social distancing, and get everybody back, I mean, we need the junior high and probably some additional space to get all of K-8 back in its entirety full time. So, that's a pretty good chunk of space given the size of that building. So, but then again, touched on the point that you need teachers to go with that space, because you got to put a teacher in the classroom. So that's might be as much of a hurdle as the physical space. So that's another thing that if we're going to go down that road, I'm sure Peter is going to be working diligently to try to find the human resources that are necessary to fill that space with educators. John had his hand up.
Not to put another monkey wrench in the mix, but KV Cap is looking to spend a lot of money rehabbing the old junior high to get it up to code, ADA compliant, fixing everything from windows to roof to heating systems and all that. So this would have to be a decision. If we went to putting money into the old junior high, it would be a requirement to have the town council be involved, because at some point we had told them that we were vacating. So I think there's a complicated mix of town council decisions and our decisions when you, although I did like some of what Jeff said there, because those buildings are already in existence, but there's been an agreement to hand that over to the town, and we reneged only because of COVID. So we just had to solve some, technical problems there if we were going to put money into that building when KV Cap already was going to. I think the town would rather have them spend the money than us.
Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, I guess, Peter, you probably got a pretty good gist on where we're at, and you've got some just one or two things worth of homework to work on to see what kind of resources kind of work together for the couple of avenues that we're exploring.
I think I do, Joel. I think I'm hearing it loud and clear. I think we're all on the same page. Get our kids back in school, however we can do that. And if there's an opportunity to plan for the future, then do that as well. But get the kids in. It's going to become more complicated and more difficult if we don't have access to that old building next year. It's going to become a nightmare. So, but I'm hearing you loud and clear, and we will work as hard as we can to make that happen, because that's the goal. I'm hearing it.
Okay. Did anybody else have anything before we move off of this topic? John doesn't like COVID. I can see that in his sign here. It's backwards though, John.
Oh, not on my screen. It's forward.
Oh. All right. Not hearing anything else, I guess, at this point. I think Peter has an understanding about direction, and I would not be surprised that as things move along, that we might end up with another special meeting somewhere along the lines to make some decisions should we get to those points where we have to make some decisions. So, all right. Well, thank you very much for all that discussion, everybody. I think we all are pretty unified on what we need to accomplish, first and foremost, and secondary as well.
Thank you. Good conversation. Appreciate the input.
So, given that, so our next meeting is scheduled April 22nd, excuse me, April 26th. That's marked down as a virtual meeting. That might, but I would like to think, hopefully, it'd be nice if we had an in-person meeting before the end of the school year. So maybe the May meeting would be a possibility. I think most of us will probably be fully vaccinated by then. And for those who don't, I think a remote option is still there, but you know, maybe we can consider that. So if there's nothing else, I think we would be ready for, oh, well, public comments. Anybody calling in for public comments? Give everybody a minute to do that. Call now. We'll give you about a minute. So, Peter, you're going to go log into the council meeting and give them all the good news. And I assume that they'll be pleased, and then we'll have the budget behind us for another year. Okay, do we have any phone calls?
No takers.
No takers. All right. Very good. Well, thank you, everybody, for all your input. And Peter's going to run off to the other meeting, and I will log into the whatever link I can find online to get there.
Do we have a motion to adjourn?
We need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We have a motion from Earl. Do we have a second?
Second, Nathan.
We have a second from Nathan. All right. If there's nothing else, all in favor of adjournment, I would be a yes.
Earl, yes.
John, yeah.
Jeffrey,
Yes.
Jay McIntyre,
Yes.
Nathan Tyler.
Yes.
And I think I already heard John. Yes. Okay. Thank you.